And good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm about to utter the single shortest-lived phrase in news today. Our top story is, because as quickly as we say it is made obsolete by the next top story and the next and three more after that for good measure. Tonight's a good example. Tonight, right now, on top of the president boasting to the Russians in the Oval Office about firing nutjob Comey, in addition to White House lawyers researching impeachment, and right alongside embattled president leaves for overseas trip, there's this. We've just gotten word that James Comey will testify again. Will testify publicly before the Senate Intelligence Committee. For that, let's go to CNN Sunderland Safadi at the Capitol. So when is this going to happen? What do you know?
Well, we know, Anderson, that as of now, no date firmly has been set. There is an expectation, according to the committee, that this will happen at some point after Memorial Day. That's what they specifically said in the statement that they released announcing this tonight. So certainly the indication is there that this will happen sometime in the near to short-term future. There had been some fresh concern up here on Capitol Hill that this would not end up happening in the wake of the special counsel, Bob Mueller, being chosen this week. But certainly they're moving ahead, and significant that this is going to be happening not behind closed doors, not in a classified setting, but in public, on camera, in an open setting, something that we understand that James Comey wanted to do himself. Now, he's also been invited by two other congressional committees up here who are also investigating this, and some registering their displeasure tonight. The Senate Judiciary Committee, the ranking member and the chair, out with a statement tonight saying they are disappointed that he turned down and declined their invitation to appear before the committee, saying that they are extremely disappointed and there's no reason that Comey can't testify at both. Anderson?
No, do we know, is Director Comey going to talk about, what, I don't know if we know what he's going to talk about, but can he talk about the notes he wrote, the memo he wrote, what the president said to him, his concerns about the president? Or because there's a criminal investigation with Mueller, is that stuff going to be off the table?
Well, that's exactly the concern that so many people had up here on Capitol Hill, this concern that because the special counsel is now investigating and appointed, that might hamstring what he's able to say. And I think that still is a very open question. Looking forward to this committee testimony, we have heard from so many members of Congress that they want to, of course, hammer him hard, exactly the details, what he said in the memo, who he shared that memo with. Of course, those details very important.
That's going to be fascinating testimony. Sunderland Safadi, thanks. Now, our old top story from about two top stories ago, or just about 2 hours ago, reporting that the president not only boasted about firing Director Comey, that he not only said that it takes the pressure off him in the Russia collusion probe, but also that he said it to the Russians, directly to the Russians in the Oval Office. According to New York Times, reporting by the New York Times, the president of the United States did just that and more. He also insulted the man, trash-talking him in front of the Kremlin's foreign minister and ambassador to Washington. The headline on Maggie Haberman and Matthew Rosenberg's story is, quote, Trump told Russians that firing nutjob Comey eased pressure from investigation. That is a headline. They write, President Trump told Russian officials in the Oval Office this month that firing the FBI director, James B. Comey, had relieved great pressure on him, according to a document summarizing the meeting. The piece quotes the president as telling the Russians, quote, I just fired the head of the FBI. He was crazy, a real nut job. The president also reported as saying, quote, I face great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off, end quote. Now remember, that meeting also featured the president sharing code word classified information on ISIS gathered by Israel that may have put lives at risk. The story hit just minutes after the president departed for an 8-day overseas trip. It's unfolding with him aboard Air Force One on a 14-hour flight to Saudi Arabia. Imagine how fun that flight must be right now, stuck on that plane with that story just breaking and 14 hours to go. The New York Times' Maggie Haberman and Matthew Rosenberg join us. This is, when I saw that, it's just fascinating reporting. What more did the president say in the meeting?
He said a couple of things, but among them, as you saw, he described Comey as a real nut job, which is a phrase that he's used about many people over the last couple of years, usually on Twitter, but sometimes in other discussions. Said that this had taken great pressure off of him, that he was not under investigation, said that he would like some help on the issue of Ukraine from the Russians, that this is an issue that's important in America, made a joke that he was the only person who the Russian ambassador had not reached out to a meeting for. Why didn't you call me? Sort of to that effect, talked about his crowd size, I believe. A lot of these.
He was telling the Russians about his crowd size at the inauguration.
I think, I don't know if it was the inauguration or if it was
just in
his
general, his
rallies
crowd
in general and
size.
so
I
forth.
think it was the inauguration.
Right,
was
but
it?
it's
Okay, well,
it was.
God knows he's talked about it all. So I mean.
Look, this is a lot of this is stuff that he's not saying much there that he hasn't said publicly, but he is saying it there in the Oval Office with two Russian officials.
And calling the former FBI director a nut job to Russians.
Right. So that echoed stuff that the president had said privately. Glenn Thrush and I had reported that right after Comey was fired, that the president had said to people there's, quote, something wrong with him, unquote, or things to that effect. But look, you can have two interpretations of this. You can hear it as adding to the sense that the president fired Comey because he was trying to end this investigation, which the president has denied. You can take a government official who we spoke to who defended the president's actions, which saying that this was actually a negotiating tactic, that the president was essentially trying to instill a sense of guilt into the Russian officials. Given that this president sees everything very personally, that is believable, that he would see it that way. His speaking style has continued to get him into trouble. You can take the view that this was done intentionally as a way to please the Russians, to say, look what I did. The counter argument is that the pressure on him was by Democrats because he says that James Comey had been a grandstander and so forth. This is going to continue this going on and on and on and on. And once again, it is information that is dribbling out. It is contra what the Russian foreign minister had said had come up. He had said afterwards that the Russian nonsense, or whatever he described it as, did not come up. This is all problematic for the president.
Matt, I mean, the White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, isn't denying that the president said those things, correct?
No, he's not. And a note about that 14-hour plane trip that Trump is on. We have a colleague on that plane, and in the final minutes, we're getting ready to get this story out. One of our editors was like, "Uh-oh, we got to call that guy," and literally got him as they were taxiing on the runway to say, "Hey, by the way, this is going to pop right after you get in the air." So, I mean, I don't know what's going on that plane, but it can't be a happy place at the moment. I think the White House, they kind of went with what Maggie had laid out, saying that this was a negotiating tactic, and that they Spicer kind of went off to us about how this is the real problem here are leakers and leaked information, leaked classified information. That's their view, and I think at this point they're having trouble because throughout the week they denied multiple stories that turned out to be totally accurate, and that started with our excellent colleagues of the Washington Post reporting about Trump giving up Israeli intelligence in this meeting. With the Russians, and the first response was totally untrue, which is absolutely totally true.
Yeah, I mean, they deny. I mean, I don't know why anybody really. I mean, when I hear a White House statement now, I don't know whether to believe it or not, because there is just time after time after time. The president has done something in a private meeting with somebody, and then it's clear he doesn't even tell his own people what actually happened, and then they're told to go out and sell one story, and then the next day the president starts revealing a whole other side to the story.
Right. There is a credibility issue. To be clear, people are not there. This is not compulsory work. If people don't want to stay in the White House, they don't have to. But it is true that a lot of people are there for the right reasons, and they get sent out to go defend the president. And then he changes his story the next day. And then, as we saw in the case of Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, the president changed his story back. He initially said that he had fired Comey on that recommendation. Then he said, actually, I did it because of the Russia investigation. And then he said, actually, yesterday, he said, actually, no, it was because of the Rosenstein recommendation. And this is hugely problematic because, again, Anderson, these are self-inflicted wounds. I mean, essentially, if he could have even fired Comey, a lot of his critics say, and still been able to do it had they had an effective plan in place, had they had a consistent explanation, had they had a replacement lined up.
Right. Had they not said things which were not true about why they did it.
Correct. I mean, and so this really is a self-inflicted error. Had he not blamed it on Rod Rosenstein, who then felt the need to appoint a special counsel, I am told, in large measure because of that, because it eroded confidence. This is all self-inflicted, and at some point, and this president is now on his first foreign trip, there is going to be an issue that the White House is going to need the American people to believe what they say, and they will say, well, his supporters believe him, but his hard base is about where his approval rating is right now. That's less than 40%.
Matt, you think about all the generations of Russian spies who have worked to try to get into the head of the president, who tried to figure out what the internal workings of a White House are, this president essentially gives them this information in a meeting in the Oval Office. Like, you know what? The president, they go back and say, you know what? The president of the United States thought the FBI director was a nut job and that this frees him up. I mean, it's kind of amazing. You think about all the spying that's gone on for decades and decades to get information like this, and now it's just handed out, on Twitter.
I wonder if they sit around in Moscow and kind of chortle about how easy this is becoming for them. But joking aside, there's a really serious issue here where the president came into office already somewhat at war with the intelligence community, and that kind of quieted down for a little bit. But we've seen a succession of events and that have culminated in kind of the past 10, 12 days that have just infuriated people in the intelligence community, in the FBI and in the CIA and elsewhere. And he needs those people. He needs them to give him information. He needs them to tell him when he's wrong. And at this point, many of them don't believe a word that comes out of the White House, just like many in the public don't believe it. And they're coming to people like us. And I know a lot of people say, oh, these are just people with axes to grind who are leaking. They're not. They're political appointees, they're career people, but what they are people who aren't particularly partisan, who don't have it, they're not pushing an agenda in this case. These are people who are seeing things they think are wrong and are horrified by them, and they realize that internally there's no way to stop it, so they're doing the last resort. They're coming to the press and trying to make it public, hoping that will stop it.
I mean, Maggie, taking it just a step back, how significant is this, considering everything that's happened over the past week?
We're grading on the news curve now, unfortunately, with a lot of this because there is so much of it. I think it is pretty significant in terms of the fact that the president is going to have to address it, that it again becomes something that we will see how consistently he explains what it was. Does it match up with what the government official defending it explained it to us as? We don't know what it means, but on its base level, it is, as you said, it's fascinating. It is incredibly unusual and surprising. Look, this president made clear he was coming to Washington to drive a wrecking ball through a lot of things. And so to that extent, it is not a surprise. He and supported by certainly his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, on this and some other White House officials, has sort of had disdain for some of the conventions and form of diplomacy. And I think that they would argue some of this falls in that. That's not what this is. This is an active investigation. And he has been either unable to or unwilling to modulate his behavior accordingly.
And I mean, again, Matt, as we mentioned, it can't be lost that this story came out right after the president took off this afternoon. I mean, can you say anything about the timing of the release? Was that just, that's when you were able to go with the story?
I think that was happenstance.
Yes.
We're not looking to kind of time stories to a trip or anything like that. And in this case, it's not like we were writing about his trip. But it's going to create awkward questions for him. I imagine he'll get on well to a degree in Saudi Arabia. I don't know. In Israel, there are going to be a lot of tough questions, and not just about the meeting where he gave up their intelligence. There have been statements from White House officials this week that have upset the Israelis immensely about the Western Wall maybe not being part of Israel, things like that. Right. And I think this just sets that pattern that, this kind of going out to the public without a plan, not having worked out, it's boring. We all get annoyed. Most White Houses, Obama's White House certainly, and the Bush White House to a degree, they're disciplined and they're kind of dull at times. But there's a reason there's a reason they do it. It's because if you don't, you just create problems for yourself and you take away from your actual job, which is having to govern the country.
Right, and remember there was talk, 24 hours ago about this, you could look at the appointment of a special counsel as almost an opportunity for this president to say, you know what? That's the investigation. It's ongoing. I'm focusing on my agenda. But here we are.
Well, Anderson, it was an opportunity for him to do that, especially because things move so fast these days that actually he could have done that, but he can't stop talking about it because, as you know, when he feels aggrieved and when he feels personally aggrieved, he fixates on something and he obsesses about it and perseverates on it, and it just becomes cyclical, and that's what you're seeing here. He literally can't stop talking about this.
Maggie Haberman, Matthew Rosenberg, incredible reporting. Thanks very much. Reaction now from CNN's Sarah Murray at the White House. Sarah, the president left for a 14-hour trip, just this story break. I mean, I'll say again, cannot imagine what's going on inside that plane right now. Is any information coming out at all from Air Force One?
Well, look, as Matt Rosenberg just pointed out, we would all love to know what the discussions are like on this plane. I have to imagine the president is doing a little bit more venting about how this Russia story will not go away. That's certainly what we heard from him earlier this week. And other than the statement that we initially got from Sean Spicer, we really haven't heard much from them in the wake of this reporting. But one thing is clear, it's going to be very difficult for them to leave these stories that are haunting them in the American press behind, even as they had hoped to embark on this foreign trip, a five-nation foreign trip, a very ambitious agenda, particularly for a newly minted president, and really refocus on what the president wanted to talk about. There were a number of things that he considered good deals that he could get done while he was abroad, but it's pretty clear that these controversies at home are still going to haunt him even while he's overseas.
When the president lands, what are his immediate plans?
Well, he is going to be doing some ceremonial things. He'll have some bilateral meetings, but I think the attention is really going to be focused on this speech that he is giving in Saudi Arabia on Sunday. We're told by our excellent producer, Kevin Liptak, who has been on the plane already, has landed in Riyadh, that as of right now, in its current form, the draft of the speech the president is slated to deliver will not mention radical Islamic terrorism, which, of course, is a huge shift from what we heard from this president on the campaign trail. You remember him out there berating former President Barack Obama, saying, if you can't even name the threat, how are you going to combat it? Now, these remarks could still change. This is a draft. We know the president and his aides like to tweak things often up until the last minute, but this speech that he's expected to deliver in Saudi Arabia could be a very different tone from what we heard from him for really over a year on the campaign trail, Anderson.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for the president of the United States, who, on the campaign trail talked about radical Islam, to go to Saudi Arabia and blast radical Islam.
Yeah, it is very difficult. And, we saw him at one point on the campaign suggest there should be a complete ban on all Muslims entering the U.S. He said a lot of things that would be very jarring given the setting that he's about to deliver this speech in. I think his aides are encouraged by one thing, though, that the president has met privately with a number of Saudis, that Jared Kushner, his son-in-law and a senior advisor, has met privately with a number of the Saudis. And both sides really want this trip to go smoothly. And that could ultimately end up being the president's saving grace in something like this, that if there is a misstep, people might sort of just grin and bear it in a way they wouldn't otherwise.
Sarah Murray, appreciate the reporting. Thanks. Let's bring in the panel. Jeff Toobin, Laura Coates, Maggie Haberman's back, Mary Catherine Ham. New York Times op-ed columnist Charles Blow is here. So is Steve Hall, who ran Russia operations at the CIA. Joining us as well is Jeffrey Lord. Jeff, I got to start with you. Sean Spicer didn't deny that the president said these things about Director Comey. Do you defend the president on this one?
No, I think he's perfectly within his rights to say them. I mean, he's the president of the United States. He can say what he wants.
Right, he can say what he wants. Is it smart?
Well, sure. I mean, you can get subjective about this. And as a matter of fact,
I'm asking you to be subjective. Is it smart?
Is it smart? I don't think it matters either way, in truth. I really don't. And Anderson, I just want to say this. We're talking about all this Russian... What? I'm sorry?
I said, I believe that's called a punt. I don't know much about sports, but I believe that's a punt.
No, Anderson, look, this is not, some smoking gun. That's his honest opinion, which Lord knows if he hadn't said it to the Russians.
His honest opinion is that the former FBI director is a nut job and that this relieves some of the pressure on the Russia stuff? That's his honest opinion. I have no doubt that that's his honest opinion, but do you think that is smart for a guy under investigation to be saying that?
Yes, I do, and I'll tell you exactly why I think it's smart. Remember this statement from President Obama? Tell Vladimir I'll be more flexible after the election, quote unquote, to the Russian prime minister, caught on a hot mic. Now that is what you call collusion with the Russians. Vladimir, for all we know, was flexible with Barack Obama to help him be reelected. Was there a call for a special prosecutor?
Right.
Is there a call for...
No, was there an investigation by the FBI? Was there a special counsel? No, and no, and no. And so I know you got to bring up Obama every time, or you got to bring up somebody else.
I got
because you can't really defend it in all fairness. You can't defend what the president of the United States just said.
I don't care. I mean, I don't care what he says to the Russians. I mean, he's the president of the United States. If he wants to say that, if Barack Obama wants to say whatever, if George Bush says, I looked in his eyes and thought he was...
If he took a dump on his desk, you would defend it.
Say it. What?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what he would do that you would not defend.
Anderson,
I mean, you're a loyal guy. I think that speaks well of you. But
Anderson, this is offending Eastern media elite sensibilities. Right here in America, they'll think, yeah, the FBI director was a nut job.
Okay.
and worse.
Look,
Right.
he's not wrong that some people do think that. I got a lot of reader email from supporters of Trump's who said that's absolutely
Thank you,
true.
Meg.
I also got, you're welcome, Jeffrey. I also got emails from longtime Republican officials in Washington who have worked with senators and so forth, describing it as quote unquote un-American. I'm not saying that's my word, that was the word that they used. So I don't think that there is a universality of opinion here, and I think we still don't really know how this plays. I do think that he is correct that a lot of people, because there is so much information coming out at such a high speed, are tuning out most of it because they just hear the words Russia and Trump.
How can you be an Eastern media elitist if you just said take a dump on TV? You know, I mean, that's like, aren't you? Doesn't that make you one of the people?
I meant dumping, documents on the desk. That's what I was talking about.
You know,
that wasn't me.
can I just? I mean, the whole nut job thing. Okay, that's perhaps intemperate language. Legally, what's much more significant is him saying that he's relieved that the investigation is over and he's now free. There is another quote in your story where he says, "I'm now not under investigation anymore."
That's not what he said. He said, "I'm not under investigation." I just want to be clear.
I'm not under investigation.
Yeah, I want to be clear on that. It's
Okay.
actually an important point, because especially because this was a readout. I'm not clear on whether he was making the point that he has made 1,000 times publicly, which is, it's not me under investigation, and James Comey has told me that. Is what he
But he does say he's relieved.
He said the pressure is off of him.
The
He's
pressure
relieved
is off of him.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That
The
suggests
pressure's off because Comey's gone?
because Comey's gone.
I mean, that's a
yes,
reading.
and
That's
that is our understanding of what he said, based on the reading of this document, and what a defender of the president's argues is that what he was referring to was the fact that Comey, and Spicer's statement essentially says it, is that Comey was a grandstander, and all of which the president has said, and he was politicizing this investigation. And that made it really hard, and this investigation's going on regardless. I'm not saying that is actually what he meant, but that is what he said.
Well, let's be clear. The president can say what he would like to say. However, there are also legal consequences of his statements.
And that is the biggest issue.
Right, and if you have
correct.
fired the FBI director
right.
who's leading the investigation
Exactly right.
into whether or not you or your campaign members have colluded, you cannot be excused simply by the nature of the office that you hold. The words still have significance politically and especially legally. And so to give a carte blanche and say, well, I'm the president, this may have been politicking, this may have been something different, it's a very different turn and distinction when you have obstruction of justice overhead, interfering with witnesses or tampering or trying to intimidate them in some way. These have consequences, and which is why I think the president perhaps should follow what the Miranda says, which is you have the right to remain silent.
Well,
do that.
But I mean, to that point, Mary Catherine, I mean, it's amazing how many times, tonight we could have been, had this not happened, we could have been talking about the president's foreign trip, about the issues he's going to be dealing with. Instead, we're talking about things he himself has said.
Yes, and he probably will not stop talking about it. There's always the hope that he doesn't have a global plan on his phone. But I mean, many of these wounds are self-inflicted. I do think, to Jeffrey's point, there have been many who are critics of the president who want to say the conclusion is collusion with Russia, and I'm going to walk or run myself to that conclusion, right? And maybe getting there ahead of the actual facts. To me, and I'm somebody who has been like, let's hold up and take a deep breath. To me, this week, two things are coming together, which is it's the convergence of the Comey story and the Russia story together in the person of the president and in his own personal conduct. And to me, that is what has turned a page. And I think you're right, Maggie, that many people are tuning out some of this, A, because they think it's just people out to get to the president, and certainly there are some of them for political reasons, but B, because there's just so much going on. But to me, that's what turned a page this week, is that this is his actual behavior, this is two storylines coming together, and he does do it to himself.
Yes, and in the Oval Office. I mean, that's the other.
And Charles, now you're going to have Director Comey testifying, because that had been a big question. Well, now that there's the Mueller investigation, is this going to go underground? We're not going to hear any details. I mean, if Comey testifies, as it seems like he's going to after Memorial Day, and if he actually talks about what his note said, that's going to be another huge chapter in this.
Yeah, but that's at least 9 days away. I mean, we don't know. At the pace that things are being revealed, the language itself is losing its capacity to actually register how big each one of these things is. We can't even digest what happened 3 hours ago because another thing has stepped on it. And I think that it is incumbent upon us to slow it down a little bit and just make people understand the gravity of what is happening.
It does after a while to all seem so like normal and just, none of the thing.
And that is, and if we allow that to happen, that is a disservice to the voters and the citizens of this country. We have to say, wait a minute, this is enormous. This is not a kind of passing thing. This is not a simple kind of way a person communicates. There is an actual criminal investigation now underway. Collusion, if he had just held his peace and said, fine, go out and hang yourselves on this collusion thing because there's nothing happened, and let the investigations proceed apace, he would have done himself a big favor. Now, collusion is only one of the issues at stake. Now it is witness tampering. Now it is possibly treason in the case of Flynn. Now it is obstruction of justice. And these things now seem to have even more weight, depending on what we know at this point, than the collusion.
You know, Steve Hall, I mean, you've investigated, we were the CIA, worked on the Russians for a long time. I mean, it can't be lost that Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador who's at the center of this investigation, learned the president's true rationale for firing Comey, or what appears to be his rationale for firing Comey, in this meeting, even before the American people did, when the president did that interview with NBC and was privy to classified information, according to earlier reporting in this week. When you see this from your intelligence background, what goes through your mind?
Well, I liked your comment earlier, Anderson. I think you'd have been a good case officer if you'd wanted to be. I mean, this is something that Russians usually have to recruit agents for inside the White House to try to get, these secrets out about who doesn't like who, and who the president is mad at. And in this case, he basically
this is
himself.
Just to interrupt. This is actually what CIA officers try to recruit agents for, to find out what's happening inside the internal workings in Putin's office. This is what Russians try to. I mean, this is what CIA officers and intelligence officers do overseas in recruiting people. This is the information they want.
Yeah. Every single intelligence service in the world, I think, probably has number one on its list of things to find out about is find out the plans and intentions of X leader in whatever country it is that you're targeting. For the United States, it's going to be, it's going to be Russia and what's going on inside the Kremlin. It's going to be the Chinese. It's going to be the Iranians. So yes, everybody wants to be that proverbial fly on the wall. Everybody wants to have a recruited spy who's sitting at the table and telling them, oh my God, can you believe that President Trump is so mad at Comey? Everybody wants that. In this case, the Russians didn't need it because the president provided himself. Look, here's one group of people that are not tuning this out, Anderson, and that's the Russians. And if you look at how they see all of this, they don't see it like we do. They don't see it through this Western lens that we see it. They remember candidate Trump when he was still a candidate saying things like, well, these sanctions, maybe we can lift them. Crimea is not such a big deal, so forth and so on. Fast forward a little bit, he wins the election, and then he says, I'm not sure about this whole Russians being involved in trying to mess with our elections. It could have been a fat guy in his basement. It could have been the Chinese. Who do we know? How do we know? And now he's in the Oval Office with guys that, by the way, the previous administration purposely kept out of the Oval Office because of the bad things that Russians have been doing for the past couple of years. So he's invited them in the Oval Office, and it sounds very much like he's trying to reassure them, hey, I'm coming back to you. I couldn't before because I had all of these, these political pressures domestically. But, now that I've gotten rid of Comey, the nut job, the pressure's off, and, I can get back to those things that I was hoping to do during my campaign. I'm not saying that that's what Trump is doing, but that's the way the Russians are seeing it.
We have much more to talk about, much more tonight, including late word that even as the president departs on his first overseas trip, some of his legal team have begun preparing in case he's impeached. They've been looking into it. We have reporting on that and late reaction to all this from a member of the House Intelligence Committee as news continues to break tonight in Washington.